Okay, so we should start now for our last session on privacy and competition. So we are going to discuss the effect of privacy regulation on competition. So it has been now like 4 years since the implementation of the GDPR in 2018. So the main elements obviously is about privacy, including consent, data collection. For instance, under an opt-in rule, firms have to get consent from consumers before collecting their data. Consumers can now also tick boxes to choose what kind of data they want to give up for marketing or tracking purposes. So on one hand, this raises the awareness of consumers about privacy issues, but on the other hand, it may restrict firms' behavior in the sense that firms have to abide by these rules before implementing their strategy. So this obviously have some consequences on their profitability or investment incentives. Furthermore, these new regulations could have different effects on firms of different sizes. For instance, bigger firms would have bigger compliance costs, more likely. So this have a consequence on industry dynamics, including competition and market concentration. Okay? So in summary, how the market has responded since 2018. Have we observed the unintended or intended consequences of the GDPR? How should our regulation look like for the future? So we have 4 amazing speakers today to talk about these issues. We have Michail Kummer from UYA, Michail Batikas from Han School of Management, and Samuel Goldberg from Stanford University, and Adrien Cervera-Jackson from NERA Economic Consulting. Okay, so each of the speakers have around 25 minutes, and the discussant will have 10 minutes, and we'll look for the keys. Okay, so Michail, you will be first. So Michail is a lecturer at the School of Economics at the University of East Anglia.
Hi. Thank you very much, Win, for introducing. I think now I might need some support on how to bring up the slides. Clicker. Click. Oh, there we go. That's easy. I can do that. Thank you. Yeah, so my name is Michail. Thank you for introducing me. And this is joint work with Rebecca Janssen and Reinhold Kessler and Joel Waldvogel. It's a paper that's work in progress, but we have also uploaded as an NBR working paper. So it has reached a stable equilibrium at this point. And it's about GDPR and the lost generation of innovative apps. And I will clarify, obviously, what we mean with this. First of all, GDPR definitely has, or very likely has, very good aspects and is a good thing, very likely so. But this paper is about the fact that nothing comes for free. And specifically, we will show this for the mobile app market. And the starting point is, I could, of course, spend the full 20 minutes talking about what GDPR does. Thankfully, Win has already highlighted a few of the key aspects. But the bottom line is it affects what firms can do with user data in several ways, and in that sense constrains how they can monetize that data, and also maybe increases the cost of handling the data. And we corroborated this in a survey that the ZEW in Mannheim ran in Germany, interviewing 650 app developers. And so when we did that, sort of they fed it back to us that they perceived severe challenges from GDPR at the time of the introduction of GDPR. So 85%, for example, reported administrative burdens, one of the biggest ones being that they actually didn't exactly know what they needed to do to comply. 50% reported additional cost, for example, hiring external service providers, hiring more employees or technical equipment. And then also in this survey, 1 in 7 reported removing an app, and 1 in 11 reported not launching an app that they had planned to launch. And so we took this and and asked ourselves whether this was true for the entire app market. Okay? When you think about it from taking a step back, thinking about the basic, simple theory of app development, then essentially, by reducing prospective revenue and raising costs, we would expect that this has consequences on the market. And we would expect to see consequences on exit, on entry, and then ultimately, if that affects both of these variables, then ultimately also welfare. And so going through this one by one, the implications on exit are fairly simple. Because once an app is in the market, it's operating in the market, it knows its revenue, and it's clear that the strategy or the decision variable is revenue, does it exceed cost? If it does, continue operation. If not, exit the market. So as revenue goes down and the cost of compliance increase, we would expect low value, proven to be low value apps to exit immediately, right? This is straightforward. It's maybe less straightforward for entry, and and bear in mind also, I'm kind of a little bit cannibalizing my results, but bear in mind also that if these are low value apps, then having them exit doesn't cost much, in the sense that these are apps that are not generating a lot of usage, not generating a lot of welfare, not generating a lot of profits. They are low value apps, and so, okay, we will lose some of them, but that may not be the big problem. On entry, it's not so clear, because the entry strategy is enter if expected revenue exceeds costs. And so if expected revenue goes down and the costs to be compliant increase, we would expect lower entry rates, but based on the decision criterion, which is on expected revenue. And then a key question is, how precise is this expectation? If this is a very precise expectation, and developers, before introducing an app, can precisely predict whether they will enter or exit, whether they will be highly profitable or not, then, of course, we know what's going to happen, and the low-value apps are going to stay out, and the high-value apps are going to enter nonetheless. And what this will mean is, however, that not much harm is done, because these apps that do enter will generate a lot of usage, right? However, it can become a big problem if these expectations are very imprecise, and if it's unpredictable whether an app will be a success or not. If it is unpredictable, some of these apps that we don't see because they never enter could have actually landed way up through the distribution on top. They could have been a new Spotify or TikTok or whatever. Who could predict the success of TikTok before it happened? So they could have landed throughout the revenue distribution very much on top, would have been very valuable to consumers, and but they don't enter, and we lose a lot. Okay. Now there is this. It's difficult to think about this, but after thinking a lot about this, it's actually it boils down to the question whether a reduction of entry by X% reduces usage of these newly entered apps by X% or by nothing. Right? If success is predictable, it will reduce usage of the newly entered apps. There will be fewer apps, but they will be used very much because they will be very valuable. And so the total usage of newly entered apps will be almost the same as before, even though it's fewer apps. Because the only apps that don't enter are those apps that nobody was going to use anyways. However, if we see X% fewer apps land X% fewer usage, then it's a nobody knows anything market, and we have lost apps, likely so, that were valuable. Of course, there's one more problem, that may be substitution. Economists have to think about that too. We will therefore have a model that accounts for that. So this is the theoretical framework that we're taking to the data. Let me summarize it. Exit right away, only for unprofitable apps. Entry reduces, but it's in terms of expectations. It comes with anticipation. And then the question whether we see a reduction in usage of newly entered apps or not, and whether that corresponds to the reduction in entry or not. Okay? So we observe almost all the apps in the Google Play Store. That's our data set. That's 4.1 million apps and 41 million observations, because we have multiple data waves. And we see all the information that's available on the Play Store. I'm not sure my pointer works, but everything that you can see when you go on an app's page. Specifically their birth dates, their exits, their installs, their ratings over time, and the quality information. We have a quarterly panel from July 16 to October 19. Those are 13 waves, and because there's so much churn, 4.1 million apps translate to the 41 million observations. And then our focal analysis is actually by time vintage. So this is a very important concept in the paper. And what we do here is we're tracking a vintage of apps, which would be all apps born in the third quarter of 2016, all apps born in the second quarter of 2017. So basically, the generation of 2017 Q2, and we track that generation through time. That gives us a vintage time observation. Okay, and that's the level of observation that we need to evaluate number of entrants, number of exits, and so on. Okay. So let's look what happens now. A little bit of raw data, and then the time vintage analysis. So when we look at the number of apps that are exiting, then long before GDPR, this was usually at about 100,000 exits per quarter. So it's not that there's no exit ever, there's always some exit. But at GDPR, that goes up by a factor 3 and then 6. And then we have a third quarter where we see another 500,000 apps exiting. So altogether, we see 1.4 million exiting of apps, where usually we would have expected 300,000 over the 3 quarters. So this is a mass extinction event, and we're losing a third of the apps in the market. But beware and remember, I've told you, those are low-value apps. Those are apps that are not very much used and for which it's not worth it to pay for compliance or risk not being compliant. So the effect to focus on is not the 1.1 million exits, excess deaths, but it's to focus on the entry for later vintages. And what we do here is we do time vintage regressions, where we regress the number of apps of a vintage V that are first observed after T periods on age and the vintage time dummy variables. And we trace out what happens to exit. And on average, after GDPR, we see 47.2% reduction in entry. Okay, so we see about half the entry that we used to see. Now, that's fair enough, but I've told you it only matters if that also translates to a reduction in usage, because it may be that we're just not getting those excess entrants that nobody will use afterwards, and levels of usage remain the same. When we look at the levels of usage of an app that's aged 1 quarter, 2 quarters, or 3 quarters, we see that their levels of their aggregate levels of usage all decrease pretty much by the 45% that we also see the reduction in entry. Right. So we can look at usage by app status, apps that are about to exit, apps that are incumbent and going to continue, apps that are just entered. The lowest bar are apps that are about to exit. They're never really used. The largest gray bar on top are apps that are incumbent and continuing to be in the market. The middle bar are the apps that are just entered. And as you can see here, their share of the aggregate usage decreases after GDPR. Okay. How much time do I have left, Win?
You still have 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Great. Okay, so I won't need so much time, so we'll have time to. So what does this then mean for welfare if we try to put it into a proper structural estimation framework? Okay, the prior is we see less entry, and it also translates to a reduction in usage of newly entered apps. So that leads us already to maybe anticipate that there will be a loss in welfare, at least by our estimation. So how do we go about our structural estimation procedure? We keep it simple. We estimate a nested logit model following the Berry 1994 framework to get a substitution parameter. That substitution parameter is very important to account for, because it's not only about whether the new apps don't generate the usage, it's also about how close a substitute they would have been for example, an existing app. Okay, so to give you an idea, yet another flashlight may not be sorely missing from the market, because if I don't get that newly invented flashlight, I could just use one of the flashlights that are already in the market, and my consumer welfare would not be much lower, right? Only if the substitutability between apps is limited and I cannot find an appropriate substitute for the app that has not entered, it's really damaging, right? If I can get the perfect substitute because it's already existing, then we didn't need that innovation, that innovative app, that new app, that entrant. Except maybe for competing on the segment, which is another important dimension. But at least from a consumer's perspective, if substitutes are available, the damage to consumers is less than if the substitutability between apps is limited. So we estimate substitutability between apps to be 0.36, and we apply this parameter and use it in our calculation of consumer surplus. We look at the pre-GDPR choice set and then randomly remove 47.2% of the apps in line with the reduction in entry that we see post-GDPR. That's our method to compute the long-term effect. Basically a predictor of where we see the market in 10, 12, 15 years down the line if the levels of entry remain at the low level that we saw after GDPR. And this results in a loss of $15.3 billion in consumer surplus, which corresponds to 33.9% in the long run. Now, obviously, this is a pretty precise calibration, which definitely hinges on the assumptions of this modeling framework. So we wanted to make sure, or we wanted to see how robust our estimate was. It's a point estimate, basically, to possibly needing to estimate the parameter a little bit different or having noise in our estimate. So what we did is we varied the sigma parameter that comes out of our estimation procedure and the percent share of apps that are removed ultimately. And then we have a second robustness check where we also allow for limited, but not. So in this framework, we're assuming no predictability whatsoever. We also ran a robustness check where we allowed for some predictability, just imperfect predictability. I didn't anticipate to have the time to go through all of this, so I'm showing you one robustness check where we are varying the sigma parameter. So remember, we estimated that at 0.36, but here we vary it and we allow it to range from 0.25 to 0.75, where 0.75 is close to perfect substitutability. And then we varied the percentage of apps that are missing from the market because of the reduced entry from 0 to 100, and this is what gives you this graph. So the baseline, which uses 0.36 as a sigma parameter, shows you the amount of welfare lost as a function of the percent of apps remaining after GDPR. So if only 20% remain after GDPR at our estimates, which is much more than the reduced entry we see, then we would lose 75% of the welfare in the market, of the consumer surplus in the market. And as all apps remain in the market, obviously no welfare is lost either. And what this graph shows you is how our estimates depend on the sigma parameter that we're estimating in the structural estimation. This is what referees will invariably ask us when we submit the paper for publication, so we've done it. Right, and so this leads me to conclude and then maybe open up the floor or just pass over to the next speaker and have questions later. Basically, GDPR had two massive consequences on Google's Play Store. What we see is a mass exit of apps, which you can go and consult Statista. It would show you the same. You can look at app entry in Apple Play Store and it will show you a plateau around GDPR after it picks up again. What we don't see are the missing apps that didn't enter because of GDPR. So that's something that can potentially down the road, especially if entry levels remain low, create a lot of harm to consumer welfare, or it basically would result in reduced consumer welfare that would have been higher. We don't see it because it's absent from our radar, but it's entry and welfare that could have happened and didn't happen. And this is a result of the unpredictability of product quality that makes these entry reductions so costly. In other words, an app market is a market where it's important to allow developers to experiment and to kind of throw out an app and see whether it flies or not, right? And the cheaper it is and the easier it is to create revenue from that, the more experimentation we will see, and 1 in 100 of these, or 1 in 1,000 of these, or maybe 1 in 10,000 of these will become a next TikTok. But not all the apps that are launched there are that useful. To the consumers, at least. I'm still not convinced TikTok is really useful, but consumers like it. Now, substantial costs of privacy come through GDPR. And that's sort of our main line of the paper when we look at the app market. It comes to the consumers. The reduction in or the cost is to the consumers because there's a diminished choice set. And again, this is a long-run effect. So if entry levels remain low throughout the years, then the choice set will be much lower than it would have been. And it comes to producers from depressed profits, lower revenue, higher costs, which we have seen translates into exit. So it does affect producers. But maybe that effect is smaller or larger. We don't say much about this. Our feeling is the harm to consumers is the larger one. The point is to point out that there are costs. These costs have to be balanced against benefits that come from the privacy regulation. And we are sure there are benefits, okay? They are just extremely hard to measure. It's established in the privacy literature that the benefits from privacy are essentially impossible to observe from observational data. And so did we try to show some benefits to users and did not manage to show any? But they might be real despite apparent consumers' disregard here. And I think the key question that the paper raises is, can and should maybe the policy be adjusted to reduce that cost, right? So we are aware there are benefits. We are also showing that there's potentially a high cost. And the question to ask then is whether that cost can somehow be reduced by tweaking the policy in a clever way. Right, that's what I have. Happy to take questions or to just pass the baton.
Right, thanks very much for the presentation. Perhaps we could, perhaps we could take a few questions from the audience. Franco?
Microphone?
Okay. Michael, yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. And let me think about the GDPR. Of course, here what you have in mind is there is a fixed cost for, if you want, the developers that comes into having to comply with the GDPR. But then on the utility, there is another effect which comes there, and there is an heterogeneous effect. You know, that some user perhaps will value the GDPR, some user might not even like the GDPR. So there is also an effect that comes from your utility, therefore from the demand. Mm-hmm. And this is the setup I will think about. However, when it comes to your exercise you're doing here, you're withdrawing from, you're doing this simulation when you're just getting rid of, 47.2% of randomly drawn apps. And if that's the case, are we, I don't know if it is true, is it that we're missing out, perhaps you're not getting the right one? Because if the story is on the fixed cost, and leave it aside the possible effect on the demand, you will have to expect that only those that have very low revenues will be the one that is affected. But if you do the random draws on your sample, you don't pick up that. But maybe it's because I was reading the slide, but I think you're not going to do that. I think there's something else you're doing. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think the justification for picking at random is that we observe that after GDPR, we also lost usage which corresponded to the reduction in entry. So 75% 47% fewer entrants, 45% lower usage on average, which leads us to believe that this is almost like nobody knows anything prior to entry. And that's why it's as if we removed apps randomly. We have a robustness check where we allow for a limited ability to predict success and sort of generate a distribution of expected success and then sample the lower tail or cut out the lower tail of that distribution, which correlates with actual success after entry. And yeah, well, predictably so that reduces our estimate of the harm, but it remains high. And it's basically in robustness check 2, which I didn't show today.
Okay, I believe Sam has
that was actually my question. So.
Okay.
No.
So are there any other questions? Okay, there.
Thank you. So you said at the beginning that the survey results showed that 1 out of 11 new apps didn't enter.
Right.
And then you find 50%, roughly 50% didn't enter. Is that
Right.
right? What could explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, sure. So what happens here is we're sampling 650 German app developers, and we have worldwide Play Store data, and we're sampling them, or we're interviewing them after GDPR came into effect. And so we're having two sampling biases in our survey. We're sampling bigger developers that are established, so otherwise we wouldn't have found them. We're not sampling prospective developers that kind of might have entered their first app because we don't know about them at all. So basically we're sampling bigger multi-app developers that are already in the market for some time. That's why they show up in our firm registry, and that's why we can interview them. And I think that's the reason. And then the second sampling bias is it's just German developers who might just be generally not necessarily representative of the worldwide app developer population. Right. So that leads us to believe that these are developers that have more resources to deal with GDPR.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the next presentation. Our next presenter is Michail Batikas, who's an assistant professor of information system at Penn School of Business. So the floor is all yours.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to present here our work on GDPR. Secondly, I want to to let the audience know. I don't know if you know it already, but today and tomorrow there is kind of meeting/conference in Brussels, the EPDS conference, where policymakers discussing about GDPR, the effects of GDPR, what they can learn, how GDPR can affect also the new regulation coming into the European Union, the DMA or the DSA, and etc. So it's these days it's kind of been really discussed, the GDPR. Now, the third one's is Michail gave us fantastic presentation and etc. on the effect of GDPR on the mobile industry, mobile apps industry. Later, Samuel will talk about the web, and me, I'm coming in between. Okay, so first I'm gonna discuss you about the effect on web, and then later on also give some kind of really sneak preview of a kind of really research that's coming right now. So it's you will have to take it with a huge grain of salt and etc. But I would like to do kind of link between mobile and web. Okay, now, so our work is called Regulatory Spillovers and Data Governance, Evidence from GDPR. This is a joint work with Christian Peukert from HSL Lausanne, Stefan Bethold from ETH Zurich, and Tobias Kretzmer at LMU Munich. Now, so it's how we start motivating our work and etc. It's about how we can regulate the digital world. Okay. Now, first of all, we know that platforms use personal data in order to deliver personalized experiences. That means in order to deliver personalized content, or to deliver also personalized advertisement, targeted advertisement. Okay, so some of us, we might like targeted advertisement, some of us we might not like it so much, and etc. And this kind of this kind of trade-off between of what can be the consequences of the usage of personal data and what can be the benefits of using this personal data. Okay, now continuing on discussing about how we can or how we regulate the digital world is kind of the latest attempts to regulate digital world has not come through cooperation between different countries, between or kind of discussions in international bodies like United Nations or World Trade Organization, and etc. There's no kind of coordination in this kind of mechanism. So we have regulations that are coming from specific countries or group of countries, and etc., like the European Union. Okay, this is the one thing. The other thing is about when we try to regulate the digital world, is kind of digital has no frontiers. So it's really difficult to regulate, and etc. It's kind of, and that leads to a lot of regulations in the digital world to have extraterritorial applications. Okay, so in other words, regulations that do not apply de jure, but they do apply de facto. Okay, and I suspect that kind of is one of the first time that I can speak on this that have heard of previously or knows about the California or the Brussels effect, because normally when I present either to marketing conferences or to kind of more management conferences, etc., we're not so familiar with this kind of concepts, etc. But in the law literature, we have this kind of concept of Brussels effect or California effects, decisions taken in California or in Brussels that affect the rest of the world. Okay, now, the focus of this work was the empirical evaluation of the European GDPR and the drastic changes in enforcement of privacy that became effective in May 2018. Now, for the non-Europeans that are in the audience, either here or online, etc., this regulation didn't just come out of the blue. Okay, it's kind of, Europe has a kind of large history of privacy regulation, etc. Okay, we can go back to the 50s when right to privacy became as a human right, etc. We have later the European Data Protection Directive, etc. And in 2002, we have the e-privacy directive that was amended in 2009 and later became what we call the cookie law. Okay, so here in Europe, we are used since almost 2010 to click on pop-ups and banners, etc. Yes, we accept, yes, we accept, yes, we accept. So all these banners that came after GDPR for us was kind of, we're used to that, etc. But non-Europeans were not so used to that, but we were used to that on that one. And later on, it's kind of all the GDPR that came into force, took effect in 2018. Now, the objective, or one of the objectives of GDPR was also the harmonization of the different national privacy rules in Europe that existed up to that moment. And later on, we look at four elements of this regulation that kind are important for our work. The first one is kind of a drastic increase of sanction regime. So the fees of not complying to the GDPR can go up to 4% of global revenues. So far, I'm not aware we have reached that fine, and etc. So far, but I might be wrong, and etc. But at that moment, as also Michail showed from the survey that he did, no one knew about that, and etc. And everyone was afraid of that might happen, etc. Okay. Now, the second element is kind of now which needed strong consent requirement for data processing. Previously, with the e-privacy directive, it was about the placement of cookies in our web browsers, in our computers, but now we're talking about the data processing. So we ask for the consent of data processing. The third element is the joint responsibility or the joint liability between data controller and data processor. Okay, data controller in our case would be the websites, the publishers, okay, and the data controllers will be the third parties, the ones that are providing technology into the websites, or in other words, also the third-party cookies. Okay. Now, why this is important? Because up to then, only data processors were reliable for any kind of, for example, data breach that happened. Okay. And the fourth element is kind of also crucial, and that also makes even more difficult our case and our work on here on how we can identify the effects in a clean and nice way and present some kind of more causal and create some kind of causal arguments and make our lives a little bit more difficult, is the territorial scope. GDPR applies to companies that offer goods or services to individuals located in the EU. Okay? But it's kind of this regardless of whether the companies or the firms are located in EU or not. Okay? And we'll go more in detail on that. So, the one side is kind of we have on this kind of 2x2 matrix and etc. We have, first of all, if we're talking about EU consumer, then firms should comply to GDPR, independent of where we come. There's a kind of mistake here. And also kind of, but it should be also here, this one should be, because this wasn't in my scene, I think it is a PDF file, it's also this, the GDPR should apply here. So the only case where the GDPR does not apply is this box here. That means that the GDPR does not apply to non-EU firms that cater non-EU consumers. Okay, this is the only case where GDPR, and this would be kind of the Brussels effect and etc., first introduced by Annie Bradford. Now, preview findings. The setting of our work and etc. is web technologies used by 110,000 websites, and by web technologies we mean advertisement, analytics, content delivery, etc., etc. And we have 3 set of findings, but in this presentation I will focus only to 2 of them. So the first one is kind of, we observe changes within and beyond the territorial scope of GDPR. Okay? So in other words, we do observe less requests to third-party servers after GDPR. Okay? And we also see these changes after GDPR to happening also kind of, we have a kind of de facto changes on that. I will explain a little bit more what I mean about that. The second finding, and I will not focus today so much on that, is kind of, we will do observe changes regarding the personal data collection. Okay? We have sustainable decrease in third-party cookies, and we have more disclosure of personal data collection, kind of a little bit more of transparency, kind of over there, at least in theory, so we say we are collecting data. And the third set of findings is kind of, we observe changes in the competitive landscape of web technologies. Okay, in other words, we do observe that the dominant third in that industry, which is Google, to increase its market share after GDPR, but this happens kind of with an interesting mechanism. So the market shrinks overall, but Google loses to a lesser extent. So that's why it's be able to increase its market share into this kind of market. Now, so kind of introduction, a little bit technological introduction for the ones that are not so familiar with that. It's kind of, each website can connect to different trackers, to different technologies, and etc. And this is kind of how we can observe them in a website. They do it by using specific technology and etc. Either they're using JavaScript or HTML code and etc. inside their HTML. And through this way, we're able to observe which are the connections between publishers and third-party providers. Now, our data set, as I said previously, consists of 110,000 websites for which we know their location. And how do we know their location? Either by using data from WHOIS historical data, or through Crunchbase, where we have information about the location of the headquarters of the firm. The second one is how do we try to measure audience, which is a really difficult task. Okay, we try to do with 3 imperfect ways, but all of them to combine together, I think it's kind of, we feel a bit more confident. The first one is the language. So we use the 27 languages of the European Union, except English, to identify websites. So if a website is in Italian, we consider it as Italian, so it's part of the European Union. Now there are problems obviously if it's kind of Spanish one, it might be from Spain, might be also from Colombia. So we have some kind of noise over there. A second way we do that is by using the top level domain. For the ones that are not familiar, the top level domain is the .co.uk for United Kingdom, .de for Germany, .it for Italy, and etc. So this is another way in order to identify. So if there's kind of a website is registered to a specific country and you have a specific geographical top-level domain, is because mostly wants to cater specific audience in that country. Now, obviously, later also we have the case of .com, which are more international, so we don't know. So again, it's kind of an imperfect way. The third way that we do it is we use data from Alexa, where we know, and this could be seen in the upper table over there, we know that if a website is ranked at a specific country. For example, in the specific example that I have here, the NewYorkTimes.com, at the period what we collected that data was number 30, ranked number 30 in the United States, number 520 in France. So that means that it has traffic from France, so it means that it caters for a French audience, so by definition it caters EU audience. On the other hand, BostonGlobe.com, okay, it's number 1,247 in the United States, but it's not ranked in the other countries. That means that in the specific example, BostonGlobe.com is considered by us as a website that should not comply to GDPR, but the NewYorkTimes.com should comply to GDPR. And for all these 110,000 websites, we have information about the technology we're using. We're using data from a public repository, which is the HTTP archive, and over there we have information about which third-party technology its website is using, if they're using third-party cookies, etc. And we have data 18 months around GDPR at the bi-weekly level. 1 year before GDPR, 6 months after GDPR. Now, results. First one. So in this kind of matrix, 2x2 matrix, here we follow the logic that I presented previously, and etc. So all green boxes here are the boxes where GDPR applies. In all of them cases, we see a drastic decrease of third-party requests. But also on this top right box here, it's this is the box where GDPR does not apply. And over there, we see a short-term decrease of around 2% of the third-party requests. Okay? Now, this is again the same way back for requests with cookies. Okay? And over there, we observe the same pattern that outside the territorial scope of GDPR, also GDPR has a kind of effect on that. Now, I'm going to skip on that, it's too much details. No reason for this kind of audience. I want to keep also the discussion at a kind of higher level and etc. Now, why this is happening? First of all, disclaimer, this is not scope of the paper, but we try to give some kind of ideas why this might happen. First of all, companies decide to apply GDPR to all consumers worldwide. Why? Due to cost or reputation. Okay, cost, as Michail was saying previously, etc., or even reputation. For example, we know the case of Microsoft that at the, when GDPR was introduced, they decided, okay, we are going to introduce and apply GDPR to all our locations, to all our services, etc., independently if GDPR, they are subject to GDPR or not. One thing is the reputation. Later about cost. For example, when what happened is kind of the first days of the introduction of GDPR, what was 25th of May of 2018, USA Today and other newspapers in the United States, they blocked access to all EU users. Why? Because they didn't know what exactly to do with this story. And there is also another interesting story that I remember today. It's about NPR, which is the public communications in broadcaster. So yes, broadcaster in the United States. What they did, they provide a plain text of the website, without any extra functionalities, without CSS to make it look better, without any kind of advertisement, without any kind of extras, kind of experience of 20 years ago. And because they didn't know what to do, and since they are a public entity, they had to provide service, okay? And so they find this kind of solution. So due to this kind of cost, you can decide to do it up to apply it worldwide. Now, firms, number one, might expect that other countries will adopt GDPR-like regulation. And somehow this kind of is what happened, because later we had the California, the CCPA effect. Nowadays we have also the Brazilian, the Australian, also China, which are all taking elements from GDPR. The third one kind of companies may preempt other countries to adopt GDPR and etc. Now, all this kind of really difficult to empirically identify it and etc. And so that's kind of, it's beyond the scope of this paper. Now, changes in the competitive landscape. Here, what we observe here is kind of, we try we measure competition by using HHI, okay? And what we do observe is kind of, after GDPR, the HHI increases, meaning that competition decreases, okay? And if we exclude from this specification Google, so we have a kind of imaginary world without any kind of Google, over there would not have found any kind of effect of GDPR on competition, which kind of leads us to think about that Google is the main driver of this increase, of this decrease of competition, this increase in concentration, in other words. And we have to think about, we have to know to think about that Google is already the dominant player in many of these specific sub-markets, like for example advertisement or analytics and etc. And becomes even more dominant on those markets. And the way this is happening is everyone loses clients or users and etc. In other words, websites, since previously we saw websites are using less third-party providers, so third-party providers are using clients. Okay, everyone is losing clients, but Google is losing less clients. So that effect has kind of an increase on the market share. Now, in a more graphical way and etc., it's kind of as you can see here on the top line after GDPR, this is Google, and the other top 5 winners of this situation, most of them are technologies that have to do with consent management, which makes sense to happen and etc. Now, kind of discussion. So, Brussels effect beyond Brussels and beyond privacy. So it's kind of what we learned out of the GDPR. It's kind of also, it's kind of, I don't present it, but it's part of the paper, is the fact that GDPR also affected mostly or more small players. Okay? So from one side we have this kind of effect of beyond European Union and also affecting small players. So that's what was happening. So the lesson that Brussels took out of it, or they might, I don't know, is kind of when they try to define the other coming regulations that are in discussion right now, is kind of about the Artificial Intelligence Act or the DMA or the DSA and etc. Is kind of going to be, again, we're going to use the same territorial scope and etc. It's kind of about consumers mostly and etc. But they're going to be focused on large players. And how do we define large players is kind of another discussion and etc. But we're going to keep also the same sanction regime with up to, by sanctioning firms that do not comply with the regulations with up to 6, 8, 10% of the global revenues, depending on the situation. So we see this kind of it's how GDPR can affect other type of regulations that do not have to do with privacy. Conclusions, we see kind of large evidence on the changes of GDPR, changes within and beyond the territorial scope of GDPR, and we have also some kind of policy implications. So we have interactions between regulations and across jurisdictions, we have de facto application versus de jure application, and we have interactions between different regulation targets. Okay, so this kind of trade-off, I don't know if you can call it trade-off, but we can call it trade-off between consumer protection and competition policy. Okay, some kind of, as a kind of joke that I say normally it's kind of in US, etc., they're really good in exporting technology. EU might be really good in exporting regulation in that sense. So this is a paper that has been really recently published in Marketing Science. Okay, so this is one, there's a QR code that you can use in order to get to that. It's open access, we have all access to that. Also Peter can put it also on the chat for the ones that are online and etc. So I had also presented to give some kind of more extra data to what Michail was saying about the mobile apps market and etc. to support his arguments and given even more findings that go towards on that, but I don't know if I have more time on that or also I should stop here.
I think maybe we take a bit of questions.
Perfect. Okay.
So thanks very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from the audience for Michail? Okay, so if there are no questions, we could move to Samuel Goldberg's presentation, because he's also talking about market concentration. So I thought it would be great to ask you 2 questions later on. So Samuel is a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy, and he will join the Stanford Graduate School of Business as an assistant professor of marketing in the fall of 2023. So the floor is all yours, Sam.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for having me. Before I dive into it, it's worth noting that it's funny to be in the same session with Michail. This is not the first time this has happened because our papers share a lot of the same themes and replicate similar results with similar data in a lot of ways. And I hope that you bear with me as I walk through some of those results because I think this is a setting in which inference is really quite difficult. So there is some value in bringing sort of a burden of evidence to these results. And then I think I'm also going to take a slightly different lens on a few of these results that I hope provide a little bit of insight here. So yeah, as it was mentioned, my name is Samuel Goldberg, and I'm really excited to be here today to present some joint work with Garrett Johnson and Scott Shriver titled Privacy and Market Concentration, the Intended and Unintended Consequences of the GDPR. So this presentation really starts, or this paper really starts from this question of can privacy policy hurt competition? There's quite a bit of theoretical evidence which suggests yes. These papers point to 2 sort of underlying mechanisms. The first is a traditional economies of scale mechanism, which is to say that larger firms just have more resources to comply with these types of regulations, and this is sort of an anti-competitive effect here. And then the second is more of just a consequences of markets here, which is that larger vendors are larger for a reason. They likely have better products. And so to the extent that markets shrink, we should see some homophily towards these larger vendors. But up until this point, we've had sort of limited empirical evidence justifying these theories. And so that's really where this paper is going to pick up. And in particular, we're going to study this in the context of the GDPR. Obviously, that's not a surprise here, which, in brief, raised the costs and legal risks to processing personal data. We're going to study this in a very similar market to what we just saw, which is the technology vendors market. These are the behind-the-scenes providers that generate this sort of ecosystem for the web to thrive. They help sites monetize their content with advertising, load that content, and even help them measure and optimize their traffic. These vendors are often also the ones that share and use personal data extensively, and for that reason, they've faced quite a bit of regulatory scrutiny. Now, I know this is essentially the last talk of the day, so let me give you an overview of the main findings in case I lose your attention somewhere along the way. We see a reduction of about 15% in vendor use immediately post-GDPR, which corresponds to an increase in market concentration of about 17% in the short run. What I'll show you is that there's some pretty interesting heterogeneity in how that plays out, both in the short run and in the long run over the course of the rest of 2018. Okay, so let me be very brief about the GDPR. So this is an ambitious privacy policy. I think most of us are reasonably aware of the GDPR. It came into effect on May 25th of 2018. And it greatly broadened the scope of what is being regulated. It did so by redefining personal data to pertain to any sort of unique individual level information. It also greatly broadened the geographic scope of previous privacy regulations, so it applies to both EU firms and non-EU firms that target EU residents. Finally, I'd be remiss here if I did not mention the cornerstone of the GDPR. This is consent, which EU regulators have repeatedly clarified what websites need in order to process personal data. Again, big picture here, what does this mean? Well, increased costs and legal risk of personal data processing. But the reality of the GDPR immediately after it coming into enforcement is it was sort of limited fines and limited compliance, right? So most of 2018 was sort of characterized by this learning period or limited enforcement actions. And in particular, I think it's fair to say that we were more distinctly in an opt-out consent paradigm. And what that means is that we should expect consent rates of close to 90%. And we'll maybe have time to dive a little bit into that at the end. So the GDPR presents sort of a dilemma for websites. And in particular, strict GDPR compliance could be quite costly. Right? It requires that firms obtain strict opt-in consent before loading vendor content. Some industry sources have pointed to strict opt-in consent rates being close to 10%, which means that monetizing their content now becomes extremely difficult because without that type of data, advertising revenues can fall substantially. Further, strict compliance implies sort of this minimization of data processing. As you heard from this NPR example, these vendors are extremely important for basic site operations. And so to the extent that websites are trying to comply by minimizing data processing, we may see a significant impact on the usability of these websites, which could be extremely costly, right? And so in practice, what this means is that we see sort of intermediate compliance steps. We see de facto opt-out consent, so sites provide notice, but they don't exactly give you easy options to opt out or opt into data collection, and they do a little bit to limit the third-party vendors they work with. And essentially what these sites are doing is they're playing off this bet that regulators are sort of under-resourced, and so the probability of receiving a fine, let alone that 4% fine, is actually quite low. And what that means is that they can semi-comply and maybe get away with it. There's a significant literature, I'm going to skip it. We just saw one of these and the most related, or two of them and the most related, so forgive me if you want to talk about it, we can do so later on. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our data. It's going to look a lot like what you just saw. So I'll start with an example. So this is a screenshot of my co-author, Garrett, browsing The Guardian. You can see his little picture in the top right corner there. This is what he sees when he arrives at The Guardian. But what's going on in the background is that The Guardian is loading a large number of third-party vendors. So all of these vendors are interacting with the browser, either placing a cookie or providing content or a variety of other services. You can see among these third-party vendors a large number of partners that you probably recognize. There's Twitter up there, you see Facebook, as well as a handful of unknowns and other indicators that you probably have never heard of. This is exactly the data that we're going to collect. And so in particular, we're going to pretend to be a French user. We're going to scan a sample of 27,000 sites regularly throughout most of 2018, and we're going to collect all of the third-party vendors that these sites interact with. Just to note, these 27,000 sites are not random. These are the top 2,000 sites from each EU country, the US, Canada, and globally. And so these are very large sites online, and we think a reasonably representative sample of what global traffic really looks like. All right, so with that, let me get into results. I'm moving quickly, but that's all right. So in the short run, what do we see? Well, so on the x-axis here, we have time. On the y-axis, we have the average number of vendors that our samples are working with. You can see immediately post-GDPR, we see that 15% reduction in the number of vendors that sites are working with. I'll come back to the rest of the plot in a second. Why do we see this sort of short-run drop? Well, it really does look like this is websites making active choices about which technology vendors to drop. We rule out a handful of alternative explanations that we think you might pop into your head. So for example, this is not exit or some sort of technology breaking. The largest vendor that we actually see exit the sample only serves 101 sites, so they're not particularly prolific. This is not the sort of sites blocking EU users story. Only 13 of the sites that we scan seem to be doing anything like that. There's a few others that might be getting close, but in general, these numbers are not nearly large enough to generate the result I just showed you. And then further, this is not sites waiting for consent. Remember, this is a bot, so it's not really interacting with the site at all. It's meant to mimic human traffic, but it doesn't interact with the site. It's not giving consent. So you may think that this is sites complying. It doesn't really look like that. Only about 10% of sites are using any sort of privacy extension in our sample, and we don't see changes in the number of sites that load 0 third-party trackers, which would be sort of a real indicator of compliance here. So the other sort of interesting thing that happens here is that you can see relatively quickly, which is by the end of 2018, these sites have returned to their pre-GDPR equilibrium. They're basically using the same number of vendors that they were pre-GDPR. Why do we think this is happening? Well, I'll show you some correlational evidence which suggests 2 mechanisms later on, which is really changes in beliefs about enforcement and technological growth. But let me tell you what this is definitely not, or what we can emphatically rule out from the data. So the first is this is not solely entry. This isn't new vendors coming to the market. We see almost no net entry in general here, right? So while we do see a few, about 2% of reach of new vendors, we also see about 2% leave. And so there's not really kind of this big influx of new vendors here. This isn't sites adding back the same vendors that they removed previously. So only about 1/3 of the site vendor ties that are severed immediately post GDPR are ever readopted by the end of 2018. And then finally, this isn't this isn't solely vendors wanting to comply at least. We don't really see a great adoption of privacy extensions, and we can't attribute this sort of growth back to the sites that do adopt privacy extensions. And throughout 2018, we repeatedly see EU regulators criticizing this industry for non-compliance. And so I don't think you should take this as them actually complying with the law. Just one more note on these sort of vendor usage of results. We can break them out by category. And you can see that across almost all of our vendor categories here, we see a reduction in usage. In particular, we see the largest reduction in advertising, which I think adds a little bit of credibility to these results being attributable to the GDPR. Similarly, the only category where we see growth in vendor uses is in the privacy compliance category, which I indeed also suggests that there's a GDPR may be causing this effect here. Cool. So I just showed you that the market shrinks in response to the GDPR, or it looks like the market may be shrinking in response to the GDPR. But a natural question to ask is, are some vendors getting a larger share of this smaller pie, right? So who are the winners and losers from this type of market shrinking? To get at that question, we're going to look at 3 different measures of relative market concentration. So the first is reach, which is the number of websites that use any given vendor. The second is relative market share, which is the vendor's own reach over the total reach of the market. And the third is this HHI index, which is a traditional measure of concentration in this type of setting. So without further ado, here are the concentration results. You can see that these sort of mirror in the reflection of the usage results. So in the short run, immediately after the GDPR, we see this significant increase in concentration. Concentration rises by about 17% before sort of quickly returning to the pre-GDPR equilibrium by the end of 2018. There's a few sort of interesting things to break out here. So the first thing I want to show you is that this is really driven by the top 4 categories. So in particular, we see the most significant increase in concentration among advertising vendors, followed by these sort of hosting, audience measurement, and social media, which are also associated with a lot of tracking and advertising. I think one of the most interesting results of the paper is this sort of perverse observation that this is not just concentration in terms of market share, but it's also concentration in terms of personal data itself, right? So we can break up vendors into those that likely use personal data versus those that don't. And first note that the concentration is really being driven by the market of vendors who use personal data. So it's not just that vendors in general, there's sort of this concentration in the vendor market. It's actually that there are a handful of vendors who are now gathering more personal data online than they were pre-GDPR. And so that's a particularly perverse consequence here if we think that that's a GDPR effect. You might think that this is, really being driven by consent. We can break out sites by those that use or don't use privacy extensions. That's not what's going on. So it's not just, oh, I adopt a privacy extension and now I can add all my vendors. No, that's not how this works. And then just as you saw a second ago, who is really driving this? Well, it looks like Google and Facebook. So Google and Facebook obviously win here. They're the ones who capture the majority of market share as the market shrinks. It's a similar exercise that you saw in the last presentation. For all vendors, we see an increase in market concentration of about 17%. If we were to remove Facebook and Google from that sample, we actually see a reduction in market concentration of about 6%. And so it's really that all these websites are choosing to stick with or switch to Google and Facebook in response to this market shrinking. So the next question you might want to ask here is, we've shown you these results in one context, the GDPR. To what extent are these generalizable to sort of other types of privacy interventions in these markets? To give a little bit of credibility here, we're going to look at two different event studies. So the first is the rollout of the IAB's, the Internet Advertising Bureau's Transparency and Consent Framework in the fall of 2020. This was a relatively popular compliance framework. You can see its adoption curve on the right-hand side there. And the second is the French regulator's enforcement deadline. So coming in early 2021, the French regulator announced that they are going to start enforcing the GDPR in the spring of 2021, and so you all better get your act together in time. And so we're going to use both of these events to see if they shift, if website behavior shifts for both of the outcomes that we care about here in response to these types of events. The short answer is that yes, for both of our outcomes, our results are replicated here. So on the left-hand side, we have the results for vendor usage. You can see the rollout of the IAB TCF v2 in gray, as well as the CNIL enforcement deadline in that line there. I think the results are most stark for a concentration. So in particular for that CNIL deadline, you see the French regulator's action is imposed, and we see a significant increase in concentration, just like we did for the introduction of the GDPR. And so I hope this gives some credibility to this idea that this is a privacy regulation result, not necessarily just a GDPR result. Awesome. So the last thing I want to show you is a little bit of how different sites respond to different types of sites respond to these incentives or these regulations. And I think the goal here is to shed a little bit of light on the underlying mechanism that's generating these disparate outcomes. So in particular, we're going to look at variation in vendor choices by site, focusing on both how they respond in the short run and how they bounce back in the long run here. In the paper, we show some evidence for 5 different mechanisms. I don't quite have time to do that today, or at least I won't bore you by doing all of that. Instead, I'll try to walk you through 3 here. Focusing on the enforcement fine design first. So what we've done here is break sites out by their EU user share. So on the right-hand side, these are sites that have the large majority of their traffic coming from the EU, while on the left-hand side, these are sites that are having 10 to 20% of their traffic coming from the EU. What you can see is that sites that receive a significant share of traffic from the EU drop on average about 10% of their vendors in response to the GDPR. That's about 2 immediately post the GDPR, versus sites that have a much smaller fraction of EU user share, dropping roughly 30% of their vendors immediately post GDPR, or about 5. Why? This result should be a little bit surprising. Why do we see the sites who have smaller EU user share responding more to the GDPR? Well, we think that this is probably due to the design of the GDPR's penalty structure, right? So the GDPR imposes a 4% fine on global revenue. So for sites that have a small fraction of their traffic coming from the EU, they have they have a lot to lose from not complying, and very little to gain from not complying, and a lot to lose from not complying, right? And so in that respect, we see sort of these very significant responses from these low EU user share sites. One sort of nice little data point here that's, again, I think adds a little bit of credibility are these sites that have 0 EU user share. These are the sites that are essentially not regulated under the GDPR, and you can see that they don't respond very much to the GDPR regulation, right? The next thing we want to sort of unpack a little bit is what are the role of enforcement expectations in generating these outcomes here. Of course, we don't observe site-level enforcement expectations here. That's not really possible. Instead, we're going to use 2 proxies for enforcement expectations, both of which are at the country level. So the first is a proxy for sort of policy salience. So this is GDPR-related search volume. You can think of this as essentially Google Trends. So how much are sites from France Googling the GDPR? And the second measure is a measure of regulatory strictness. This comes from a survey run by the EU in 2009, which asked sites in all EU countries how strict they perceived their data regulator to be. Focusing on policy salience first, on the left-hand side you can see that search volume really spikes around the introduction of the GDPR before falling. That seems sort of obvious. And then on the right-hand side, what we've done is break out these vendor sites by whether or not they come from a country that has below median search volume, that's in that light gray line, versus above median search volume. That is, if they're coming from a country that seems very interested in the GDPR versus a country that doesn't seem particularly interested in the GDPR. And what you can see is that if you're coming from a country where there's a lot of search volume, where the GDPR seems to be a topic of interest, you both reduce your vendor usage by more in the short run and return back to your pre-GDPR usage more slowly than if you were coming from a less salient country. And so we think that gives a little bit of evidence that maybe the enforcement expectations or the saliency of the policy is playing a role in who changes their behavior. We can do a similar exercise for that regulatory strictness measure. So in blue, we have sites that are in countries where the regulator is not really perceived to be very strict, versus in red, we have sites that come from countries where the regulator is perceived to be strict. You can see that return to pre-GDPR equilibrium is a lot slower for sites coming from stricter regulated countries. And in that sense, it does look like enforcement beliefs may be playing an important role here. Last thing, this is a small point, is we do see increased adoption of privacy extensions. So this is sort of a minimal viable product way of complying with the GDPR is to adopt a privacy extension. We see an increase over time from about 10% to 17%. If you adopt a privacy extension, you add back vendors, on average about half a vendor, and so it is sort of a funny little swap there. But this is really not responsible for that return to pre-GDPR equilibrium. As I said earlier, it really doesn't explain that bounce back like it would need to. Great, so let me wrap up with a summary here. So GDPR has both intended and unintended consequences. We give a little bit of novel empirical evidence to this privacy competition tension. In terms of intended consequences, we see a reduction in web technology data sharing. In terms of unintended consequences, we see an increase in vendor concentration. And it does look like sites with the most EU visitors reduce vendors the least. And so you should question the incidence of this policy a little bit and how we can make that better targeted. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for your presentation. If I can jump in, I just want to ask a general question to our session speaker. Because in the first presentation, Mike has talked about GDPR may have an adverse effect on innovation, and then it may increase concentration in Michail and then Samuel's presentation. I was just wondering if we should have a more balanced view in thinking about the intended consequence of GDPR. So for instance, in recent studies that I've conducted with my co-author, I found that so it could happen that the GDPR may increase market concentration, but then on the other hand, the negative effect on entry may not necessarily harm the consumers, in a sense that if we use data to measure the app's performance, then imitation of these apps becomes much easier. And if the restriction of entry is restricting these copycats, then actually it could benefit the consumers by motivating firms to engage in real innovation. So this could be one of the benefit. And then the other one is actually from our online audience. He mentioned that if GDPR is succeeding in deterring the entry of harmful apps, does this not demonstrate that it is working well? So for GDPR. So I was wondering if you three have any comments or remarks about the more on the benefit side of the GDPR. I know it's a bit outside of scope, but perhaps you can make a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, also because the question from the audience was directly about apps, and I think your paper also seems to be talking about copycats, which is sort of an app phenomenon. This is invariably true. So the challenge here is that sort of the benefits to the users suffer from the well-understood privacy paradox, which arises whenever you compare what users will report, people will report, for example, in surveys or in the lab, and then when you study their actual behavior and their willingness to give up money, for example, for having more privacy, or to do something that's a little bit more painful to have more privacy, we don't see them wanting to spend anything to have more privacy. So in the observational data, we never see long-term willingness to pay for privacy. And then on the other hand, users generally report that they appreciate more privacy. And so our take is that it's very, very difficult to talk about the ultimate benefits of privacy, really. In two ways. One, there is a dedicated subset of the population that is very concerned about what's happening in the app market, and they think it's a great thing. We should maybe even shut down the entire app market because it's just ultimately so detrimental what will happen in the long run, that what we're getting in the short run and the free navigation is just not worth it. And then there's the other take, which is sort of the take that we're taking, that sort of if users use it, then it's useful to them, and that generates value. Right. I can give anecdotes. Like 2 weeks ago, we needed a medication for my son before we wanted to board a ferry at 9 a.m. And so we had to be there at 7:30. And so I needed a pharmacy in Ipswich at 7. And Google told me where I can find one. We drove there, picked up the medication, we boarded the ship, and he had the medication. Otherwise, we would have missed the ship. So what's the value of having the Google service here? It's hard to quantify, really, but sometimes it's very valuable. It's just tricky to ultimately pin this down. Okay, back to the question. Of course, if there's intentionally harmful apps that are solely built to infringe privacy and GDPR shuts them down, that's clearly a benefit, right? That's like having no quack medication that is harmful, and users just don't know that this is harmful, and they take it, and they take bleach against COVID. So of course, if we can shut that down, that is useful, and that would be a useful effect of GDPR. And as you point out correctly, that's not inside the scope of our paper. We cannot say whether what the developers do with the data they're collecting is intentionally harmful or not. And so that's a challenge here, of course. So what we are doing is we're quantifying the cost to the users. We're not quantifying the benefits to the users, and that's unfortunately because we would love to, but we cannot. And if we could, and that suffers from both observational issues that we don't have the data, and also methodological issues that we see this discrepancy of what users report as how much they value this versus what they would be willing to pay for it. So ultimately, it's very, very, very difficult for two very important reasons. to quantify the benefits from GDPR to the users. But we are definitely certain and convinced that there are benefits. Like 3 of our authors are from the German-speaking world and have strong beliefs that privacy protection is very valuable. I have also personal beliefs, which are also outside my data, that I think what we should consider doing is we should consider forcing the companies to at least strongly consider forcing them to delete data that's older than 2 years, because ultimately there's a strong question of what's the value of data that's older than 2 years and why they should store this forever. But these are considerations that are maybe outside.
Okay, thanks very much. So, Michail, do you have anything
So,
to add?
yes, I will start with a specific question about copycats and later we'll make a bigger argument. I'm not so sure about this kind of GDPR kind of really stops a copycat or some kind of that, because the issue about the GDPR is a kind of, as also Sam was saying, and also somehow increases the cost of entry. Okay, so but if you still have a little bit of more capital and etc., you just run it over, you comply, and you still make your copycat game and etc. Have a lot of them and etc. So I don't know at the end. So at the end, it's kind of you just increase the cost of entry. So if someone can afford it, can still continue with this kind of copycat business model etc. So I'm not so sure that GDPR can affect that one. And coming back to that kind of, I will also want to state 2 points that I totally agree with Sam and Michail here etc. First of all, it's kind of the one benefit that we could easily, we both, Sam and me, we were able to identify is kind of this data minimization, what's part of the GDPR, this kind of data intended consequence. So firms were able to collect less data. Now, over there, this comes with a really big caveat, and it's kind of because also our data are kind of multiple firms can have the same amount of data. So Google knows me, etc. Facebook knows about me, and etc. So this kind of they know about it. They have the same more or less type amount of data, and etc. So there's no kind of exclusivity over there. The first one. Second one is about Michael's point, and etc. We would love to really find out the net effect. This is what all of us barbers are here, etc. And it's really difficult to find out what's the real effect. It's also said kind of part of how I started motivating our work and etc. is kind of for us Europeans and etc. privacy is a human right. So kind of how do you exactly measure a human right and etc. Specifically in the digital world over there. So it's kind of also GDPR was about consent. So the story is kind of yes, I give you the consent to use my personal data. It was not about you cannot use my personal data, and etc. I can still continue after GDPR giving all my personal data, and etc. This is not the issue. This is about consent, first of all. And what is really missing, and etc. And I don't know if it's going to be done with regulation or not, and etc. Is the transparency and education. Education on users. What are how the data could be? What is the value of the data? If also there's another caveat problem is how do you value the data, first of all, and second, to make firms transparent of what they're doing almost exactly with our data, and etc. And later we can decide, yes, I can continue giving my data because, as Michael said, okay, with his anecdotal story, yes, there are benefits out of that. And there's a kind of benefits with by giving up personal data because I can get a much better product. At which cost is the issue? And try to find out the net effect. Really difficult.
Thanks very much for your comment. What about Sam?
Yeah, I won't belabor the point. I'll echo what both of them have said. I mean, I think measuring the gains to privacy is just extremely difficult. We have not solved that problem. I will lay the blame more on our feet than say it's not solvable. I think people are working on it, and it's just very difficult, right? And especially when you begin to think about the very multifaceted regulation that the GDPR actually is in practice, right? One thing that is worth thinking a little bit about is the GDPR has pushed sort of more generally this innovation in these markets that none of us are talking about here, which is this move away from third-party cookies more generally in the advertising technology sector, right? And so even if you were to think about welfare and it were to turn out that it was bad for consumers over the last 3 to 4 years, it might be very good for consumers in the next 10 to 20 years if we move away from third-party cookies, and we believe that consumers don't like those, right? it's almost an impossible problem in that sense, I would say. And it's worth noting the harms because they can inform how we should make this policy, make similar policies in the future, how we should design them, right? But it's not necessarily right to, I think evaluating it is actually a much more complicated thing than sort of listing, oh, maybe we should think more carefully about this part of the bill versus that one, right, in the future.
And if I may grab the baton once more, I think so. One of the points that we're making in our paper is that we see less entry. And we argue that we need experimentation in the app market. So if the app market is a market where you need experimentation, be that copycats or other forms of experimentation. So I take the point that if innovation gets redirected, but at the same level, then this will be beneficial. But sort of the concern would be if it lowers the amount of experimentation we get in this market, then it will ultimately harm the value of the market. And so what regulators might want to take another second look at is whether they can do something to lower the burden of GDPR on experimenters and allowing that 14-year-old kid to write their first app without being afraid of tons of fines.
Okay, thanks very much. So we'll take one question from Amelia, and then we'll move on to the discussion, and then I will open the floor. Okay, Amelia?
So mine was, to Daniel, it was literally a understanding question, which is, I really like the work, but you showed the concentration going up and then down, and you gave us a whole load of reasons that didn't explain that pattern.
Yeah.
But you never told us a reason why you thought
why it goes back down. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we have a good explanation. To some extent, that is sort of this readoption and reproliferation. It looks like as websites readopt, they don't adopt, as I said at one point, they don't readopt the same vendors that they severed. And so they actually end up adopting new vendors, and that leads to this sort of decrease in concentration. I don't know, we don't have a great story for tying it to the GDPR other than sort of this enforcement expectations argument that I gave for site usage.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll move on to our discussion by Adrien Cervera-Jackson, who's the Associate Director in NERA Antitrust and Competition Practice. And it would be nice to hear a more balanced view on the practice side. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Win, and thank you to the three of you for those fascinating and thought-provoking presentations, which obviously all suggest that the benefits of privacy might come at the expense of more concentration and potentially less choice. And with privacy laws like GDPR and the California Consumer Privacy Act in the US, there's increasing debate about the extent to which the goals of competition and privacy are incompatible or instead complementary. And so in that context, I wanted to make some observations on three related issues. So firstly, the interplay between competition policy and data protection, reflecting on the experience in the UK. Secondly, the role and economic characteristics of data in digital markets. And then thirdly, the rise of damages litigation, in particular class actions that we see in the UK and other countries relating to loss of privacy and how economics could help place a value on consumer data, albeit it's a challenging exercise. So first I'll share some thoughts on the interaction between competition and privacy. So in the UK, the CMA and the ICO last year published a joint statement on the relationship between competition and data protection in digital markets. And they recognize that there are strong synergies between the aims of the two regimes, but there is also the potential for tension between them. So, for example, the two policy goals are aligned where they both promote user choice and control over their personal data. But in some circumstances, the two objectives, so promoting competition on the one hand and protecting privacy, might be in tension. So an example might be a data sharing remedy that would give third parties access to personal data. This could boost competition and lower barriers to entry, but it could also lead to more widespread processing of personal data, which would raise privacy risks. The CMA and ICO stress that both competition and data protection regimes are complementary because they both aim to protect consumers. And they say that carefully designed regulatory interventions can support both policy objectives if they make sure that users are informed about how their data will be used and can exercise meaningful control over it. And where there are tensions, they can be resolved on a case-by-case basis and through close cooperation between the regulators. So this was touched on yesterday. A good example of this in practice is the CMA's recent investigation into the Google Privacy Sandbox, where the CMA accepted commitments from Google to address its concerns. So briefly, this was about Google's proposals to remove third-party cookies from the Chrome browser. And this had both an impact on competition, because third-party cookies help online publishers and other websites target their advertising more effectively, so they can raise revenue and they can fund their content. But at the same time, these cookies impact privacy because they allow consumer behavior to be tracked across the internet. And so the two regulators have been working together throughout the investigation to develop solutions to address both types of concerns. And in particular, one of the commitments involved Google would involve the two regulators in developing and testing its proposals to ensure that they achieve both pro-competitive and pro-privacy outcomes. And so I guess this is a really good example because the intervention was designed to ensure that the proposals could improve privacy without adversely affecting competition, which sort of links to the three papers. So next, I just want to briefly recap on the role of personal data in digital markets and some of the economic characteristics that can lead to competition concerns. So I'm sure everyone will be familiar with these, so I'll go very quickly. But data plays obviously a central role in the digital economy and the business models of many of the platforms. Data helps firms improve their services, as we heard yesterday, for example, click and query data for search engines. And data is also critical input for digital advertising. Now, personal data specifically, so this is information that relates to an identifiable individual, plays a particularly important role in markets, both in the user-facing services, but also in digital advertising. And the role of data has become more and more important. As more data is generated, there's better capability to analyze that data, and it can be personalized more. And so obviously this creates benefits in terms of more innovative, better services, but it can also raise concerns, for example, where lack of access to data might raise barriers to entry. So in online search, as Jens was saying yesterday, the more data you have, the more accurate or relevant your search results can be. So the concern would be if a smaller player can't compete without access to that data. And of course, the characteristics of data are such that there may be an incentive for firms to aggregate and accumulate data to create more value. So there are economies of scale and scope associated with combining different types of data. So there's an incentive to aggregate the data to unlock this value, and there's also an incentive to perhaps prevent third parties from accessing it. Now, sharing the data might create value for society in some cases, but sharing personal data can raise privacy concerns. And so the final theme I'll touch on is linked to this, which is the rise in damages litigation relating to privacy loss. So in the UK in recent months, we've seen several class actions being brought on behalf of consumers claiming for damages for loss of privacy. So for example, in February, a collective action was brought to the CAT, the Competition Appeal Tribunal, against Meta on behalf of 45 million consumers in the UK, seeking over £2 billion in damages. So a very big claim. And this claim is alleging that Facebook abused its dominance in the UK social network or social media market by imposing unfair terms and unfair prices to its users. And in particular, it argues that users were harmed because if they wanted to use Facebook, they had no option but to hand over their personal data. And the claim argues there were no alternatives to Facebook. Now, that will depend on the scope of the relevant market, of course. But the action also argues that Facebook demanded an unfairly high price for its service. So it was taking valuable personal data from its users. And conversely, it's effectively paying an unfairly low purchase price to its users for its data, because essentially the marginal cost of providing its service to an additional user is quite low, but the marginal revenue it can generate from monetizing that personal data in the advertising markets is quite high. And so the claim argues that Facebook earned excessive profits. Now, Facebook argues that users choose its service because it delivers value, and that users do have meaningful control over how their data is used and who it's shared with. So in this claim, it will involve assessing the losses to consumers from giving up their personal data, and this will require placing a value on that personal data. And in fact, a team at NERA advised on one of the first major European privacy damages cases under GDPR a couple of years ago. So the key issue there was how to measure damages resulting from a violation of GDPR, because of course, small differences in the valuation of damages can have a big impact on how much compensation the violating firm has to pay out. So in that case, a large European company was allowed to collect certain types of data from its customers, but the company then used that data to figure out the interest of those customers in other potential services that they might want to offer. And the local data protection agency found that this was a GDPR violation, the use of that data for other purposes. And so the debate in that case was about how much compensation the firm should pay. So a local court awarded hundreds of euros to an individual claimant. So the defendant hired NERA to estimate the damages using economic methods, and the team used a survey-based technique called conjoint analysis, which looks to value different attributes of a service. And it used this technique to try and put a value on the information shared. And the outcome was a much lower value than the award that the court initially gave. And so I think this just illustrates that there can be quite large differences in the value of personal data. But as more and more of these cases are brought over the coming years, there'll be more opportunity to put into practice different methodologies for valuing loss of privacy. And I'll just finish with one more point if I've got a minute. I think when thinking about how to value loss of privacy, there are a number of factors to take into account. So there's the nature of the harm suffered. So is it a tangible financial harm, for example, financial fraud, or is it more intangible, like loss of trust or distress suffered from the privacy breach? Consumers themselves, when handing over their personal data, might not trade off the benefits of using the service for free now versus paying for it with their data in future. And the scale of privacy harm might vary from one individual to another. So a lot of this in practice will turn on the empirical analysis. And so there's a real role for economics to shed a light on basically the value of consumer data going forward.
Okay, thanks very much for your discussion. Okay, so I will have to close this session at around 5 p.m. What we'll do is that we'll take questions from the audience, and then we'll each make one remark, and then I close the session, okay? So we'll start with perhaps Adrien. I know that you prepared some fantastic question to the panelists.
Yeah, so I mean, this is quite a simple question, really. So you've all illustrated the costs associated with GDPR. I just wondered if you had a chance to reflect on any changes you'd make to that regulation or to any future regulations to mitigate those costs and improve that benefit-cost trade-off.
Okay, and anyone, Franco?
Yeah, thanks. So it's probably more for some presentation, but yeah, it's more for some presentation, but for everyone. I think the one thing I was thinking about is this. What happens first for these, say, like the case of Google, we're looking at Facebook, and what this company have done in addition, possibly, they've changed the way you bid, they have investing in different technologies, they've acquired apps sophisticating, and they changed a little bit the game, and you can say, well, as long as it changed in the US, and the impact in the US was the same as in Europe in terms of vendors, there should not be a problem. But the additional thing I was thinking about is, what will happen now, in your case, in your story, if you take all the vendors that move away from any other website and go all to Google's, the revenues remain unchanged, how would that be measured? Is it concentration changing, or is concentration remaining the same? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your question. Sander, you have a question.
Yeah, this one is to Sam again. Are there any pre-trends in the vendor use there? So is there a permanent reduction in the number of vendors despite it rising back to the original?
Okay, are there any at the back? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's just a question about concentration. You do have to concentrate on how you define the size of the market. And I just wanted to understand, are you talking about a global market in each of those cases? And then how that interacts with the fact that there are local dimensions to the regulation and the interpretation of different regulators having different levels of strictness. I just want to understand what that definition was over time.
Okay, Jens?
Thank you. This is more, again, a comment than a specific question. In 2013, Edward Snowden came along and revealed us lots of things about what the US government is doing, and thereby raised the issue of privacy to the consciousness of many of us for the first time. Actually, back then, several people, me included, started to think about privacy from an economics perspective, which then led to many, many things, and one of the things was the GDPR in 2018, right? Now, the GDPR triggered your nice research, all 3 papers. And one of the things that for sure this kind of provision has done, because it raises the issue of privacy, the privacy paradox is less severe, because we are more conscious about the fact that privacy is an issue, right? So this is more people reading the newspaper. They are aware of the fact, oh yes, privacy, what the heck is this? Should I care about this? Under which conditions? And so on. So this is, I guess this is a very kind of uncharted and unnoticed effect, where the pure existence of this law about one specific subject, privacy, kind of brings it to the attention of people and thereby may alleviate part of the problem. A small part, maybe.
Okay, thanks very much. So try to be very precise in your response. I know that there are lots of questions, maybe around 1 minute for each of you.
Maybe I shouldn't start.
Yeah, can I start so I can
Yes,
just tick these
go
boxes?
ahead.
Sure. So, first, in the span of of our data there, we don't see that kind of innovation, right? So Google's not introducing a bunch of new technologies, at least in that short run, I guess. To the extent that the introduction of a new technology would be the introduction of a new vendor, we classify things at the Google level, not at the Google Ad Services versus Google bidder services, and so that should play out. It shouldn't do too much to our concentration measures. In terms of pre-trends, we don't have a lot of pre-GDPR data. I think they certainly have more. We have replicated their findings as well as and our findings using their data as well as another data set that's publicly available. I tried to make it reasonably clear, if I wasn't, I do think that the appropriate interpretation of our results is generally as descriptive, right? So that we should be careful about causal interpretations. The GDPR is big. It is difficult to deal with, and so any sort of causal inference here is tricky. And I think we don't have pre-trends, and so I won't even pretend that it's causal, let alone talk about robustness or something like that. I do think that, look at all the evidence, and that it does paint a picture that is informative, though. There was another question about how we define markets. So this is sort of a unique. I'm sure you face a similar problem. If you want to, you can take this if you want.
No. So our approach was kind of, we're thinking later on how we define the market. We're going to go for local markets and etc. EU firms with EU audience and etc. EU firms with non-EU audience. names kind of always kind of the four boxes that we have in our approaches and etc. And we're thinking of how we should define the market. So at the end, what we did is go with worldwide market. The reason kind of is it has so many spillover effects, because if the concentration of Google increases in one market, probably this has effects on the other one, etc. So it's kind of really difficult to put some kind of local boundaries into that. Specifically, we're talking about the same firm, because if we're talking about, for example, Der Spiegel, which is published in German, etc. Somehow we can, even though it's still digital and somehow we can limit it, etc. But we're talking about Google, it's so difficult to limit, so that's why our approach, and I think your approach, etc., is kind of to put it at the worldwide landscape. And since I have also the word, and etc., to answer the question about the discussant, and etc., was about kind of this was about the, and I think that our work somehow, or every work that's been done around GDPR, and it's continuing been doing, and etc., had an impact on the way we're gonna do the next regulation at the European level, specifically in one dimension, kind of what we observe and etc. You somehow observed and somehow in another way is kind of this regulation hurted probably much more small players. So the small players in the markets, the small firms and etc. were really hurt about that, and probably the compliance cost was disproportional to their size and etc. So that's why the new regulation is about the large firms. And how do you define large firms? It's another game, but this is kind of how I think that, because they kept other elements of this GDPR. For example, the sanction regime, the applicability to whom it applies, etc., but except of the size of them. So I think this, our work somehow has at least indirectly affected in this way.
Okay, Mike?
Just briefly adding to this question on the regional effects, very interesting as such, and can show very interesting nuances. One problem for paper writers is it will invariably be table 17 in the online appendix ultimately, and it's very hard to talk about it. So it will, because ultimately it's 27 countries and it's different everywhere, and then you can write a page about it, but it's interesting in the detail. The question on pre-trends, I want to say the following. We see on the app market, we do see actually Google implementing and cleaning out the house already starting in 2016, 2015. We do see Google taking measures that prepare their Play Store for GDPR. Whether, this is ultimately just because of GDPR or because of the various developments during that period, as Jens has pointed out. Hard to say, hard to see, but we see a pre-trend in privacy. Actually, that's the biggest pre-trend we do see. But that also makes it hard to evaluate GDPR's effect as such. To the question of whether we suggest any changes to the regulation, well, I think that's a very important question. I think that's the important question. I want to second, we all feel like we cannot quantify the exact precise effect that GDPR had on any certain outcome. In that sense, that the evidence is descriptive, but the timing of the effects and the variety of pieces of evidence do paint the all-over picture that there is a large effect. We also feel like it affected small players much more, and it's a good thing maybe that the EU is trying to think about applying it to larger players. Or just generally, I think it seems to be important to think about how can this regulation be designed such that smaller players have a little bit of a, that they can catch a breath before the regulation hits them, so that they can try something, and yet protect the consumers. That's the one thing. And the big thing that nobody has said yet, and that's why I want to conclude on this, I think the regulator should spend intellectual energy on trying to build in a program evaluation mechanism into any new regulation, okay? Is there, for example, a way that we could have rolled out GDPR in a staggered fashion, apply it on certain countries, not on others, apply it to a certain set of apps, but not to others, apply it to websites first and only later to apps, can we build in a program evaluation mechanism that allows us, that is designed at least to try to quantify the effect of the regulation and to catch the pitfalls that it might have had. Of course, we as researchers are grateful that they don't do it. That gives us a lot of possibilities and opportunities to write papers, but maybe as a regulator it would be cleverer to build it in upfront, as we require it from third world countries when they roll out new programs and regulations. Maybe we should do it as well.
Okay, thanks very much for the lively discussion. We've certainly learned a lot about the market development since the GDPR of 2018. But today's session mostly focused more on the firm side, like innovation, market concentration. I think much more work can be done on the consumer side. For instance, it's the negative effect on entry benefiting or hurting the consumer. There are a lot more other dimensions that we can think of. Are there excessive entry, copycats, any deceptive behavior from firms? So I think much more can be done not only on the empirical side, but also on the theoretical side, and to think about how best to design competition and regulation in these fast-changing online markets. And with these, I'm going to hand it over to Sean, who will introduce our speaker for the closing remarks. Thanks very much for the contribution.
Okay, this is bringing us to the concluding moments of the CCP conference itself. After these concluding moments, we will have some cocktails right next door, so please don't think it's all over when we leave this room. There's still plenty of time to be together and to chat, and there will be some remarks at the cocktail too. But we wanted to have some closing remarks today that are a special surprise that we've been able to put together for you with our CCP member and visiting professor also, Damien Girardin, who has just tremendous experience over many years in a variety of competition law activities, and I would just note that his research recently has been absolutely among the top in antitrust on SSRN, and we're really delighted to have him with us. And at least part of what he's going to talk about, I think, is some of the useful future research that might be done that would have relevance for policymakers. So I'd like to hand over to you, Damien. Thanks you so much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm between you and the drink, so I'll be short. Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to perhaps raise two topics, or discuss two topics with respect to future research. And they're both, these topics really come from my practical experience, because I'm a professor, although most of my time now is spent as a practitioner, and it's on this practitioner experience that I wanted to focus and then derive perhaps some remarks with respect to future research. So I think the first thing I wanted to discuss, because it's an important topic and it worries me to some extent, is the growing ineffectiveness of the European Commission as an antitrust authority. This is the authority I've been practicing for 25 years. Just to give you a flavor, most of my work is doing Article 101 and 102 cases, or antitrust cases, essentially in the tech sector. So this is, I'm not going to focus on merger or state aid, but more on antitrust. And I think that if you look at the production of DG Comp in that field, and if you read the papers and if you listen to Americans, you will say, oh, DG Comp, there's so many decisions, so many cases, they're doing so many things. But my view is that their output is actually quite weak. They're not producing that much, a few decisions, but nothing in terms of high quality report, the sort of things that the CMA does, for example. I think the output is of variable quality, and recently the Commission has lost twice before the EU courts, in the Intel case and yesterday in the Qualcomm case. and the output is also quite slow. So these investigations take forever to the point of being pointless most of the time. And as a result of that, there has been some sort of, vertical and horizontal decentralization. What I mean by vertical decentralization is that when I started doing competition law, the national competition authorities in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in the UK, which was still a member then, were not relevant. You would never bring a case there. And in fact, most of these authorities were focusing on relatively petty matters. But in the meantime, they've really grown in significance. And a lot of the most exciting work is done by these national competition authorities. So there's really a shift. And I think it's partly due to the fact that DG Comp does not deliver enough. The second sort of form of, it's not really, a form of decentralization, but it's a sort of horizontal switch with ex-ante regulation. As you've known, the DMA, which is basically in the pocket, and the DMA will deal with digital markets when it comes to gatekeepers. And I think the DMA is definitely a good thing. I'm a great fan of the DMA for many reasons. I've always supported it, but I'm a little bit worried about the implementation because I read yesterday that the implementation will be, the teams in charge of implementation will be a mix of DG Comp and DG Connect, with more DG Comp people on issues like self-preferencing and more Connect people on some other issues, for example, perhaps those dealing with data or something along these lines. So I fear that one will reproduce the bad practices or the weak practices you see at DG Comp when it comes to the implementation of the DMA. So what does it mean in practice? Well, there's an idea I've been thinking about, a long time ago, and then it sort of, and I was not the only one, and it sort of died out. And it's about institutions and structure. I'm not convinced that having DG Comp within the European Commission is a good idea. I think there would be many merits to take it out, basically. Whether it's realistic or not, I don't know. But I think that it would be a good step, and I think there should be more thinking about it. Once you move from being a full-time academic to a sort of, more of a, 1/4 academic, 3/4 practitioner, you realize that procedural issues and institutional issues are actually super important. They're more important than substantive issues. When I was just writing papers about rebates and vertical leveraging and these sort of things, I was only focused on substantive tests. And now I think that what really matters, of course you need tests, but are institutional and procedural processes. They're really critical. And I think there's a need to do more research in that space. So that's essentially for the lawyers, although economists may have a good thing to say. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the complexification of competition policy issues. And if you look at the space in which I do most of my work, I come across issues such as, ad tech, horrendously complicated, and the Apple app anti-tracking or ATT rules, algorithmic manipulation, abusive use of data, and so on and so forth. And these issues are really complex. And when I start, focusing my work on competition law, the big issue was how to introduce more economic analysis in competition law, right? For a very long time, the European Commission and national competition authorities were formalistic, right? If you read the old decisions on, for example, exclusionary abuses, they were very short and very formalistic. There was no economic thinking in them. And so the big shift and that happened now, it started to happen almost 20 years ago, right, was the introduction of economic thinking into competition law. Has it been a success? I think so. You know, although, again, if you look at some recent losses of the European Commission at the General Court or at the Court of Justice, you may think that there's still some progress to be made. But it was a significant step. I think we need to make an additional step, which is the integration of technologists into competition law. And there was a conference just next door at the CMA, which took place yesterday and still today. And, you know, I could only attend yesterday, but, you know, my takeaway from the conference, and also I had a lot of side discussions with CMA people, is that this is the new frontier, basically. If you really want to handle these sort of cases about ad tech, the privacy sandbox, and, you know, cloud gaming now, there will be a market investigation on cloud gaming, but also on browsers, you know, lawyers and economists won't do. I mean, you need to have data scientists, you need to have technologists, to use a very broad term. And it's good that the CMA is taking the lead. They've got a team now under the leadership of Stefan Hunt doing that. The French Competition Authority is doing it as well. They've got a smaller team with Jan Gutmann, but I think they're doing great work. Once again, where is the European Commission? I don't know. I'm not aware of the Commission having any data scientists involved in cases, although I understand from Olivier Gerson that they might have in time a sort of, you know, CTO, you know, along the lines of the Chief Economist Office. But I think it's really essential to go down that path. Let me give you an example about the sort of questions that I think we'll be increasingly facing, and where, you know, you really need evidence-based, data-driven answers. One question I spoke about at that CMA conference yesterday was, how do you deal with security and privacy claims made by gatekeepers, right? So the interim report of the CMA on mobile ecosystems came out last Friday. And the standard argument made by Apple against reform, against opening, was security and privacy. It was everywhere, absolutely everywhere, right, left, and center, right? So they don't allow side loading, they don't allow third-party app stores, they don't allow cloud gaming, they're very restrictive when it comes to browsers, and so on and so forth. Why? Security and privacy. So how do you distinguish between legitimate privacy and security claims and pretextual claims? It's a very hard question. It's an extremely hard question. And I think that increasing, and if you think about, you know, ex-ante regulation, the DMA and the DMU regime in the UK, these questions will pop up all the time, because each and every time the competition regulator, you know, or the regulator generally will say, well, you know, why you need to leave these restrictions to allow more competition in your ecosystem. They will say, sorry, privacy, security, not possible, the consumer will suffer, it's a differentiator, etc., etc. So that's the sort of question which I think which really require some collaborative work between lawyers, economists, and technologists. And I was sitting next to Stefan Hunt for dinner yesterday, and he told me that they're effectively working side by side at the moment on these cases. And that's very exciting. That's why he liked his job. Now, think about research. My experience is that it's not easy for lawyers and economists to work together. It's very easy in practice, and we do it all the time. But in academia, it's very hard. Why? Because the set of incentives are very different. right? Lawyers like to work on exciting things, you know, policy-driven, and where there is case law, right? I mean, there is this decision, or there is this case, this investigation, and we want to write something about it. Economists, they like the issue, but they need to publish in top journals. And so that means that if you've got a good data set about fluctuation of sugar prices in the 18th century, you might prefer to do that because, you know, you can show your skills, and if you've got a good method, get published, rather than writing a paper about, you know, the privacy sandbox, because it's messy, right? And because editors might not find this a proper subject. And for me, it's always been the barrier, especially with non-tenured people. People who are tenured, they're freer, they can do stuff, but still, you know, it will be more people who are typically also involved in policy or regulatory institutions or, you know, consultants rather than the sort of hardcore economists. Now, if you want to integrate, you know, technologists, I mean, computer scientists in the equation, that will make things harder, I believe, right? Because they may have a different set of incentives. And I was talking to my other neighbor at dinner, who's a professor of computer science. I said, okay, you know, what are your incentives? What do you guys do? He said, well, there are two types of people. There are people who are highly theoretical, you know, doing really the sort of big mass kind of thing. And then there are people who are kind of very practical, right? So who are the right partners to deal with economists and lawyers? I don't know, actually. He said, well, you know, it's not so easy. Although this fellow was quite policy-focused, so I think he will be a good interlocutor. To cut a long story short, you know, I think that these are the sort of questions that will become central to competition policy, especially in digital markets, but perhaps more broadly, because today everything is digital, like it or not. Retailing, production of many things, everything is digital. And then how do you integrate this new crowd of computer scientists into policy and decision making, but also in academia, because, I mean, obviously there is a need. And one of the things I liked, once again, about the mobile ecosystem, you know, market study, the final report, is that, you know, on some of these tricky questions, they had commissioned a report from technical experts to support their thinking. In some case, it was a consultancy. In another case, you know, academics. So I think there's a lot of exciting work. I mean, I've listened to the last panel, which is dealing with this sort of work, and I found it extremely interesting. But let me stop here.
Okay. Then I'd just like to thank you very much. Okay, and now we'll move out where I am told there should be some very tempting concoctions awaiting for us, and so I'd like to thank everyone here and everyone who's been involved with the organization of this event for doing a great job. Peter Courage especially. I'm not sure I see you, but yes, thanks so much. Okay, and thanks to the group that's been in the back that came down from Norwich for us. We really appreciate you, and hope you can hear us when we start. Okay, everyone online, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been, I hope you've enjoyed what's happened, and do tune in for what we do next year. Thank you.